Hi everyone. Over the next few days I'm going to be shooting a video on pivot filing and burnishing using a Jacot tool. Here's what I have in front of me. I've got brass tweezers, Rodico, some pith wood, a sights tool for measuring pivots. I've got a combination pivot file and burnisher, and we'll talk about what that is and why it has both elements. I've got a movement I want to work on, in this case the Illinois Bun Special. I've got some oil here to lubricate the pivot as I burnish it, and in this case I've got a Steiner Jacot tool. The Jacot tool is a manually operated hand-driven lathe, and I've got a bow, an improvised bow made out of coat hanger and fishing line. I started shooting this video a few days ago when I was working on another movement, the Waltham grade 225, which you haven't seen in a while. And as I was doing it, I was ad-libbing my explanation, and I realized as I was doing it that my explanation wasn't very good. So I want to come back and do this in a more serious way to really understand or convey my understanding of why we're doing it, why we're using the tools that we are using, and the process, the actual practice of burnishing pivots for a watch train. So stay tuned. So what's our objective in using the Jacot tool? The objective is very simply to go from a pivot that is worn or damaged and causing high friction with its surrounding bushing or jewel to one that is nicely shaped, cylindrical, highly polished, and one where there will be very low friction between the pivot and the jewel. So I've drawn three types of pivots here. All of them are straight pivots with square shoulder, as would typically be seen in a watch wheel train, although occasionally you'll see conical pivots, like on a balance staff. Whether we're talking here about a conical pivot or a square-shouldered straight pivot, the principle is the same. We're trying to remove distortions and wear and get to a smooth, work-hardened surface that will cause little friction when in contact with a bushing or jewel. The first pivot that I've drawn here, it retains its cylindrical shape with square shoulder, but you can see I've drawn in points of wear here. So the reason this might happen is your oil gets contaminated with grit over time, with dirt, and this scores the pivot. And these scores may be they may be light or they may be quite deep. So that's a scored pivot. Here is a pivot that is both scored, worn, and misshapen. So for example, if a watch pivot is running for a very, very long period of time unlubricated, what's happened is that the grit and junk that accumulates in the pivot has actually worn the pivot away where it bears against the pivot, where the jewel bears against the pivot, and we're left with something approximating a mushroom shape. So we want to put this back to this, no wear, cylindrical, straight pivot, with square shoulder, a nice sharp square shoulder. So that's our objective in using the Jacot tool. So how do we get from here to here, or from here to here? Well, for that purpose, I have here a combination pivot file and burnisher. Let's start with the pivot file, and you can see from the condition of the case that this one is used comparatively less often. So here's my fine pivot file. It's a double cut file, meaning it's cut this way and this way. And the purpose of the file is to reduce the size of pivots quickly. Well, why do you want to do this? So if you have deep grooves that are running not longitudinally on the pivot, the only way to get rid of that wear is to reduce the size of the pivot. And this does this quickly and efficiently. Now let's turn to the burnisher. The burnisher, relative to the pivot file, is comparatively smooth. However, the burnisher is itself a superfine file and has a grain laterally across its surface. The burnisher has a different purpose than the pivot file. The burnisher's purpose is to work harden the surface and push longitudinal unevenness over into a highly polished surface. So if you've used your pivot file and you cut down the pivot will be cylindrical, but there may still be small ridges running longitudinally along the pivot. That's where the burnisher comes in. The burnisher is going to push material over and smooth it out so that we have a very hard, very polished, wear-resistant, low-friction pivot. Now, because the burnisher is in fact a file, it will remove a small amount of material, but much less aggressively than the dedicated pivot file. The burnisher has a different purpose to create a work-hardened surface. So let's review the basic nomenclature of the Jacot tool. This is the Jacot tool, or Jacot lathe. Like any other lathe, it has a headstock and a tailstock. Running through the headstock is a headstock spindle, which is fixed in place using this knob here. Attached to the end of the spindle, but freely able to turn, is a drum to which you affix the bow line, and that enables you to turn the drum. On the drum are carrier pins, which, when the drum is advanced using this knob, protrude through the spokes of a wheel, allowing you to impart power to the wheel. At the end of the spindle, and I have an extra one here, is a female center, a female dead center. So what this is a indentation into which you insert the pivot that you're not going to be working on, your good pivot. Each spindle has two such female dead centers corresponding to different sizes of pivots for different kinds of watch and clock work. Mounted in the tailstock of the lathe is a tailstock runner. There are spare runners here, here, and here. And each runner end is equipped with an attachment to work on either the sides or the end of watch or clock pivots. So, for example, in this runner, on this end, we have an attachment to work on the sides of watch pivots. And what we have here is a series of flat beds, and at the end in each bed there is a groove corresponding to a particular pivot size. In addition to the groove, this flat bed is to guide your tool in applying it to the workpiece, making sure that your burnisher or pivot file, as the case may be, is level and in constant contact with the pivot that you're working on. Each bed is associated with a number in hundredths of a millimeter. So this groove corresponds to 6/100ths of a millimeter. It's my understanding that in the Steiner Jacot tool, this number refers to the jewel size that it will reduce the pivot to, such that that pivot will be able to operate in that jewel size. So for example, if I have a jewel with a hole of 6/100ths millimeter diameter, and I want a pivot to be able to run in that jewel, then I would use this bed of size 6. However, I can't comment on other Jacot tools. They may be set up so that when you reduce the pivot to the height of the groove, it is actually 6/100ths millimeter diameter. On the other end of this runner is what's called a lantern. And a lantern is a very thin piece of steel drilled through for various pivot sizes. And again, there are a series of numbers here corresponding to different pivot sizes. And what the lantern allows you to do is work on the ends of pivots, either reducing them in length or somehow shaping their ends. So for example, balance staff pivots, conical pivots, are slightly domed at the end, and using this attachment would allow you to work on that dome, burnish the end of the balance staff pivot. These are very fragile, and so I keep them under this cap. In addition to the parts of the Jacot tool that I use on a regular basis, the tool also came with a number of accessories. This is a pivot gauge, which I don't use very often. I tend to use a more modern gauge with jewels set in a piece of steel, and I'll show that later. It came with extra lanterns. I've had to use one because one of the lanterns on the tool came broken, and it came with some old burnishers, which I have never had reason to use. Okay, that's the basic layout of the Jacot tool. So I said before that although the burnisher's primary purpose is to work harden material and not to remove it, the burnisher is itself a fine file and will remove material. A kind of natural question that I had for a long time is, in order for the burnisher to do its job burnishing, i.e. smoothing out material, does it also have to have the ability to remove material? In other words, can we not just have a perfectly smooth burnisher and avoid removing material while burnishing? The answer to that is no. In order to burnish, the burnisher must have an abrasive surface, as you see on mine here. I readily confess that for quite a long time after I got the burnisher, I didn't even think about this question. I did no maintenance on the burnisher. But having read a little bit more about it, including in Henry Freed's Watch Repairer's Manual, the consensus seems to be that not only does the burnisher have to have an abrasive surface in order to burnish, but you must do periodic maintenance on that abrasive surface. So a variety of texts that I consider to be authoritative recommend drawing the burnisher laterally across a coarse abrasive, such as emery or wet and dry paper stuck to a flat surface, or using a coarse sharpening stone such as a carborundum stone. So I think this is a topic that is not well covered in a lot of sources, and I just want to make it clear that yes, in order to burnish, the burnisher must be a file. The burnisher must have an abrasive surface. However, obviously, the more grain you put in it, the more aggressively the burnisher will remove material. And I think it's important to be mindful about the distinction between the burnisher and the file, that you always have the file to reduce pivot size a lot. You don't want a burnisher that reduces pivot size a lot. You want to finish the pivots using the burnisher with the necessary consequence that they will take off a small amount of material. So I also just want to discuss the shape of the burnisher, its profile, and the types of burnishers. These comments apply equally to pivot files. So here's my burnisher from the top view. Here it is end on. You can see, and I hope this is in focus, that the burnisher is not a perfect rectangle. It has two corners that stick out further than the other corner, here and here. These are the corners that will be applied for this burnisher to the workpiece, and they have two distinct shapes. This corner is rounded and is for use on conical pivots such as balance staffs, or as you might see in higher rotation wheels of higher grade watches, such as escape wheels. The diagonally opposite corner is a sharp corner for use with straight, square-shouldered pivots, as you'll see in most of the gears in a gear train for most wrist and pocket watches. The burnisher has a type, in this case, gauche. And indeed, if you look at the burnisher end on, you'll see that this burnisher leans to the left, and I believe that's the origin of right and left burnishers, this being a left burnisher. So if the work is coming from the left and I am burnishing on the top, I want a gauche burnisher, because in the case of a square-shouldered pivot, this sharp corner will be at the pivot root, thus ensuring a very sharp square shoulder. So I'm right-handed, and typically right-handed people use a left burnisher, a gauche burnisher, and vice versa for left-handed people. So this is a kind of confusing nomenclature, but if you're right-handed, typically you'll use a quote-unquote left-handed burnisher or a gauche burnisher. I believe the origin of the name is the direction of the rake in the profile of the burnisher. If I'm wrong about that, I would be very happy if someone would correct me. So let's just take a quick look at our targets for this evening. So this is the third wheel of the Illinois Bun Special. This is the top pivot. I went through the entire wheel train of the Bun Special, and I took really close looks at all the pivots. I found significant wear only on the third wheel, perhaps indicating that indeed this watch was relatively well cared for and regularly serviced in the past, notwithstanding the butcher of a job on the balance staff, which I have to correct. So on this pivot, I don't see really much, if any, mushrooming, so I don't see really significant wear, but I do see some scoring around the circumference of the pivot. So I'm going to be looking to reduce that wear, get rid of that wear by removing material, and then bringing the pivot back to a highly polished surface. Let's now look at the bottom pivot of the third wheel, and we're going to see much the same story. If I can get it on screen there. There we go. Again, a fairly worn pivot with some scoring, some abrasions, but no severe misshapenness. So these are the pivots I'm going to be working on tonight. I'm probably not going to do the rest of the wheel train. I've found in the past that if I burnish all the pivots, often the watch knocks the banks. In other words, the amplitude is too good, and I have to think about either increasing the lock on the pallet stones or going to a weaker mainspring, which is inconvenient. So I tend to work on the worst offenders in a watch wheel train, not on every pivot. So in the case of this watch, it's going to be the third wheel, top and bottom pivots. So how are we going to proceed? First, I'm going to get an accurate measurement of the pivot's current diameter using this Sights pivot gauge. You could also use the pivot gauge that typically comes with your Jacot tool. I am then going to locate an appropriate groove in a runner in the tailstock of my Jacot tool to set that pivot in. I want the pivot to protrude above the level of the bed so that I can work on the pivot by applying the burnisher or pivot file to it. However, I said that the numbers in the Steiner Jacot tool correspond to jewel sizes. That is, if I reduce the pivot to the level of the bed, the pivot will run in a jewel of that size. So if I measure the pivot at a 26, I know that if I start with a size 26 in the Steiner, I'm actually going to be reducing it slightly below a 26. For that reason, I might actually begin with a 26 in the Jacot tool instead of immediately going down size to 25 or 24. I am then going to work my way down sizes until all wear is removed in the pivot, and the pivot has a highly burnished, polished surface that is wear resistant and low friction. There's two things to be said about how far and how fast you want to go down pivot sizes. First of all, you don't want to go down too far. You want to retain the appropriate amount of side shake in your jewels. And while you may be able to re-jewel easily in a modern wristwatch with friction jewels, in an old pocket watch with rubbin jewels, a now obsolete type of jeweling, this is actually rather difficult and labor intensive. So you want to be careful about how much you're reducing your pivot. Second, you want to be careful about how fast you are reducing the size of the pivot. And the reason for that is that to work on the pivot, you're applying one end of the burnisher to the pivot, and the other end is going to be resting on the flat guide that keeps your burnisher level. Now, if your pivot is protruding only slightly above the bed, then the taper applied to your pivot will be very minimal, so small that typically you can't see it with the naked eye. If, however, you start with a pivot that protrudes way above the bed, you're going to end up putting a taper on the pivot, which is not what you want. We want to achieve cylindrical pivot or as close to cylindrical as humanly possible. And for that reason, it is important to work the pivot in beds that are not too small, right? We want to start slow and proceed slow so that we maintain as close to a cylindrical shape as possible. Okay, I now have my Jacot tool set up in a bench vise. I'm using a magazine to catch a wheel should it fall out. This isn't as worrisome if you're doing train wheels as opposed to balance wheels where the pivots are super fine, but nevertheless it's a good idea to catch things. I'm now wrapping my bow around the drum, and this will ensure that when I pull the bow, the wheel spins toward me. Okay, so that can sit off to the side. I'm now going to measure the first pivot of my third wheel. I'll start with the top pivot. So my pivot just fits in a 28. So I'm going to begin with the 28 groove in the tailstock runner of my Jacot tool. I've got that set up there. I'm now going to mount the good pivot in the headstock spindle female center. So I can pull the tailstock back for this. Insert the pivot, then bring the tailstock runner forward to mount the pivot I'm going to work on. You want to make sure that the pivot is securely in the groove, but none of the shoulder is in the groove. You do not want any of the shoulder in the groove, only the cylindrical part of the pivot. That looks good to me. Okay, I've now got my third wheel top pivot set up in the grooves of the tailstock runner of my Jacot tool. And I'm going to begin by filing the pivot using the pivot file. The carrier pins are through the wheel, so that when I pull toward me, the wheel is going to spin toward me. And that means when I have the file applied to the pivot, I'm going to be working in opposite directions. When I push away with the bow, I'm going to pull toward me with the file, and vice versa. Okay. So I'm going to begin by placing the file level over top of the pivot. And you should find that if the pivot is protruding above the bed, that you should be able to catch the pivot using the file and move it. And I can see that's the case here. I can catch the pivot. You may be able to see the wheel moving as I move the file. So I'm now going to begin filing. Okay, so I spent at most 2 minutes actually filing, and I've reduced from 28, and I'm now on the 26 groove. I found that my file was bottoming out on the groove bed almost immediately. I just checked my top pivot, and I've gone from quite a worn and somewhat mushroom pivot to an almost perfectly cylindrical pivot with very little wear in a very short period of time. So now's a good time to switch to the burnisher. Unlike the pivot file, the burnisher used with a smearing of oil to help clear away any metal particles that may be coming off the pivot. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, I've now done a few minutes of burnishing. I've now got down to size 26, and I can tell because I'm no longer feeling any contact through the burnisher, between the burnisher and the pivot. The burnisher is moving smoothly and quietly over the bed. So now is a good time to take stock and look at our pivot. I can just find it in the microscope here. There we go. So there's our top pivot. After a few minutes of filing and a few more of burnishing. So we can see that this is pretty much what we want. Our pivot is highly cylindrical, highly polished, and free of wear. So that's great. That's what we want. I'm going to settle with that for the top pivot. Now it's time to do the bottom pivot. And I think this time I'm going to perhaps file a little bit longer. If I had to critique myself on this top pivot, I would say that I didn't spend long enough with the file, and I ended up spending too long with the burnisher because its rate of decreasing pivot size is much slower. So I'm going to be a little more aggressive with the file this time, I think. Okay, I'm bringing you guys close in again for a wrap up. So there's the bottom third wheel pivot on our Illinois Bun Special, highly polished and ready to do good service in the watch again. To recap, there's our refreshed third wheel top pivot, also looking good and ready to go back in the watch. So that's my little video on how I use the Jacot tool. You can see it with the NAWCC bulletin underneath. I'm sure they won't mind. So that's going to do it for pivot filing and burnishing for this bun special. As I said, there was relatively little wear on any of the other wheels, so I don't think I'm going to bother with them. If you have any constructive feedback or comments on anything you've seen or heard in this video, I would be very, very grateful for it. I've tried to convey as best I can the extent of my knowledge about the use of the Jacot tool, but I'm always finding out things that I didn't know. And if you know something that I don't, or if I've said something wrong, no worries. Put it in the comments, let me know, so that I can learn and that I can get better as a watch repairer. So I want to wrap up by giving an overview of the Illinois Bun Special project as it stands right now. I've received a lot of parts in the last week. Mainspring, crystal, balance hole jewel. This is Clean Time Jewels on eBay, QB stuff. The guy's name is Quentin. He does some great work making balance hole jewels for all calibers of American pocket watches. Really recommend you check him out. And I've got a staff, so I got to replace that. That'll be a future video. I also have to replace the impulse jewel, so that will be the subject of a future video on the Illinois Bun Special. So that's that. Here's the Waltham Grade 225. I burnished the pivots on this one, did my full pre-cleaning and inspection. Really too bad I bungled my Jacot tool explanation on this one and got so frustrated I deleted it, because I managed to actually straighten a conical pivot on this one on the balance. One of them was bent, so that was really exciting for me. I'm also going to be doing a video on making a substitute bushing for a, substitute jewel setting for a rub-in jewel. I'm going to be using a friction jewel to replace a third wheel main plate jewel on this one. So that's the state of that one. This guy, I finished this guy a few weeks ago. It's running so good. Just dialed in the regular a little bit, and believe it or not, this cheap old little 7 jewel watch is keeping great time, and just charming me. And I've got another little project that'll be coming up, a little ladies cocktail watch, but I won't get into that now. Okay, as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you like what you see here, and you haven't already, and I will catch you guys on down the road.